some slides, and I wanted to just start by saying why I've initiated this series of debates across the region. And it's basically because I think we're all concerned about the way our politics is going. And in my team of staff, we had a meeting about a year ago, and we were really quite concerned about the rise of the far right and some of the more unpleasant aspects of politics that have come out since we had the EU referendum. And I think what we felt was there was a sort of vague sense of unease, but we couldn't really pin it down or define what it was we were concerned about. And so we spent some time analysing, and right across the team people had insights to offer, and I'm really just going to share some of those with you tonight. And then we're really interested to hear what the other speakers, who are some of the real experts in this field, and also what you have to contribute a bit later on. So I wanted to start by explaining, as I see it, the difference between populism and fascism. And I think populism in a way has given rise to fascism, and it's a particular way of approaching politics. And to me, populism doesn't come from either the right or the left. It's just a sort of style of doing politics. Whereas fascism is clearly very much on the right. So what sort of things does populism do? Well, I think it's very much an oppositional way of doing politics. It's basically a way of being critical and opposing things. And populists very often don't make a proposal. They don't make a consistent proposal, but what they do is promise impossible things. And I think we can see that very clearly in terms of the Leave campaign during the EU referendum. It was inconsistent. It couldn't all be delivered at the same time, and a lot of it was, as we're finding out now, actually impossible to deliver. And so the reason that's dangerous in terms of democracy is that if democratic politicians have offered you something that's impossible, they can't deliver it, and then you start to lose faith in democracy as a system itself. So my view is that politicians should make positive and consistent proposals, and they shouldn't just offer you a whole load of things that are just like going shopping, and they can't actually turn them into a consistent platform. So I think we're seeing this kind of dangerous populism from various parts of our political spectrum, and obviously sitting in the European Parliament I see a lot of this going on in lots of different countries. So when we started thinking in my team how are we going to address this issue, Corey Fletcher, who's one of my staff, actually has studied this to some extent before, and she said, oh, there's a really interesting study from Umberto Eco, who's an Italian historian and novelist, and he carried out this study in 1994 looking at the way how you could really define Italian fascism. And he actually has 14 signs of fascism. I've only got 10 minutes now, and so I can't cover them all, but they're all here in the leaflet. And the really disturbing thing for us was that we saw all of the signs in contemporary British society. And I'm just going to run through three now to tell you the kinds of things we're talking about. And this is the first one, this idea of fear of difference. And I think we're all very aware of the fact that that's really going on in our society now. We're seeing a rise of xenophobia, we're seeing the creation of outgroups, we're seeing an increase in hate crime. And in one of the previous, I have the benefit of being at all these talks, and this is the fifth one that I've done across the region. And so I'm learning as I go, and one of the really important things somebody said to me at an earlier talk is that you can create any sort of other group. So Leavers and Remainers are becoming these groups. And the way to get around this is to find something in common with the person in the group that you think is different from you. And I found that quite challenging in terms of some of the people I work with in the Parliament. But I am now challenging. And then there's this appeal to social frustration. If you look at the Nazi Party in Germany, it was a tiny, marginal, basically ridiculed party up to the point when German unemployment started to go through the roof. And I think in terms of what's happening now in our communities, we can see very much that all these years of Tory austerity, all the pressure on services, the bad quality jobs, the fact that the response to the financial crisis was to create more inequality. The people that caused the crisis were still wealthy. The people who hadn't had anything to do with the crisis lost their jobs and saw their living standards decline. You know, that sense of social injustice, again, is a really important underpinning for the rise of the far right. And then the third one is this idea of selective populism. I think this is an extraordinary prescient quote here from 1994. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. And how much we've heard that in the past couple of years. And also this idea of an emotional response I think is really important, whereas politics, okay, it's always an emotional business, but you have to be able to stay in that realm of rationality, where you have to commit to try to do that. And I think populism and the far right deliberately abandon that and try to whip you up emotionally rather than appealing to your intellect. In fact, there's a disparagement of the intellect. So, Also around the same time, somebody referred me to this most excellent book by Timothy Snyder on tyranny. And the great thing about this book is that the guy, Timothy Snyder, has studied both Soviet communism and Nazism. And so he's interested in tyranny, not right or left, just how you control populations. And the other great thing about this book is it's short. So he's boiled down everything he's done into a short book with 20 chapters, and at the end of every chapter it tells you what you can do about it. So I've just given you 3 examples of that, but I really recommend you buy the book. It's a terrifically empowering book. So firstly, believe in truth. I think we're all aware of the way we're seeing an increasing rise in disinformation, and this is why it's great to have Dan here to talk about political communications, and it's why it's really important to have good local journalists who challenge your local politicians. And also it's important that you don't spread disinformation yourself, because actually there's so much information whizzing around in social media, and as Mark Twain said, you know, the lie has got halfway around the world before truth has got its boots on, and we've never seen that being more true than it is today. I don't personally like the phrase fake news, because I think if it's news then it's true, and I think journalists should be held to that standard. So I think we ought to refer to this as propaganda, because that's really what it is. What can you do? You can ask for evidence and reliable sources. You can be clear about who you can believe. If somebody can't be trusted, you shouldn't have them on your media. I mean, Boris Johnson, top of my list. If somebody's obviously told a lie, why are they appearing in our media again? It's ridiculous. And we should all value intellectuals, especially the ones we have with us here tonight. Listen to those you disagree with. Again, this is quite a challenge for me in my work in the European Parliament, but this is what we need to have a flourishing democracy. We have to avoid this offensive or militaristic language. I'm a Quaker, but I find myself saying I'm fighting Brexit. You know, it feels like it's desperate. It feels like those military vocabulary is appropriate, but that's one of the things I think that gives rise to this conflict-based view of politics. And also avoid the echo chamber. Make sure you're following people on social media who you actively disagree with. I follow Fishers for Leave, for example, because I represent them, so that's a good thing, but I don't just follow them so I can attack them either, I promise. And lastly, do your politics in person. I think we've seen a rise in this idea of collectivism, being in your own bedroom, you know, reading scary stories, you don't have anybody to talk about them with. I think this corporeal politics is really important, and anybody who was on the anti-Brexit march in London, or the People's Vote march in London back in October, you know how empowering it is to be there with other people, or Extinction Rebellion, or any of those things. I think it's really important that we do our politics physically and with other people. That's one of Timothy Snyder's recommendations anyway. I'm afraid I've got him on that slide as well. But I think it's important to try and pin down what it is that's going wrong with our politics, what it is we're dissatisfied with. And I think we are actually seeing signs of sociopathy in our politicians. For example, the easy ability to lie, the total lack of remorse for being caught out in a lie. Daniel Kerchinsky, as somebody called him recently. The superficial charm, but underneath basically self-serving, just thinking about your own career. We really deserve much better than this. And then there's the use of these far-right tropes by our politicians. Jeremy Hunt used this idea of comparing the EU to the USSR in the European Parliament. It was causing massive offence. He said that at the Conservative Party conference. And then Saeed Kamal, who's the leader of the Conservatives in the Parliament, then went on to say that Nazism is National Socialism, so it's a form of socialism. So the leader of the socialist group there had to stand up and say, actually my father was killed by the Nazis for being a socialist. You know, so it's just a completely ahistorical, propagandist way of describing things. And what does Jeremy Hunt really have in mind for us? You know, this idea that we're going to join the invisible chain of democracies that includes Singapore, as I show on my tweet, hardly a flourishing democracy. And the main point here is that these people are not doing this because they believe in this or because they think it's good for you or good for the country. They're doing it to advance their own careers. And that is one of the things we should absolutely refuse to accept amongst our politicians. And then there's politicians who think that by acting tough and being militaristic, they will advance their careers. And we've got Gavin Williamson here who, you know, is always boasting about how much he'll build up the military and how he'll set up all these new bases across the world. And this really scary tweet from Johnny Mercer, who is a Plymouth MP and so in my patch, where he says the application of violence to defeat the enemies of the nation has become worryingly unpopular. Effectively praising violence. And nothing wrong with fighting. Yes, killing for values you believe in. I found this really disturbing, but it's just one sign. There are lots of signs. There are generals now appearing in TV studios in full uniform. That never used to happen. You know, this bringing forth of the military into our political life. I think is another disturbing sign of what's going on. So, what do we have to do about this? I think, above all things, what we're seeing is a breakdown in our political system because of the failure of our constitution. I often think this is a little bit like, you know, we had sewers before everybody else, we had trains before everybody else, and they're worn out now. And it's a bit the same with our democracy. You know, we moved into being a democratic system before other countries. That's why we're called the mother of parliaments. But unfortunately, mother's now a bit toothless. We haven't been looking after her. You know, we need this significant constitutional reform. When I saw they had scaffolding on Big Ben, I said, well, when they take that off, you know, will we have a written constitution, a fully democratic second chamber, and a fair voting system? Unfortunately, probably not. But I think those are the kinds of demands we should be making, so that the way we vote is fairly translated into seats. And also, if we had a properly elected democratic second chamber, they would now be coming to the fore, as the first chamber is failing to deal with Brexit. You know, that's a really important role for the second chamber. But they daren't get involved because they don't have that democratic mandate. And then there's the idea of deliberative democracy, you know, giving people more involvement. I mean, we're a lot more educated as a society. We have a lot more leisure time than people did when our system was set up. And people want to have more of a say. So why not set up something like citizens' juries where people can spend time deliberating on these important issues, having expert advice, you know, and then informing our democratic process in that in a much more connected way than what's happening at the moment. So I really think, you know, I mean, it's great that you're all here because it means you're concerned about what's happening to our politics, like I am. But what I think is really encouraging is that everything's going to have to change. You know, Brexit represents a total failure of our political system. And so what we've got to make sure is that we ask for what we need. We make sure that as these changes happen, they go in the direction of creating a really flourishing democracy. And so the things I think we should reclaim are genuine freedom of speech, not just the ability of certain people to tell lies, but actually having space for good journalism and making sure that we don't have newspapers that are just owned by wealthy people as an opportunity for them to spread their views. Not having fake think tanks in our media all the time just working for American billionaires. You know, true freedom of speech. Representative democracy, again, I've got to say I think fair voting system is really important there. I think part of the reason we're not getting the quality of representation we need is because 500 or so of our seats never changed hands. North Dorset, I think it was 1872, that was the last. I think it was created then. So you know, what's the point of anybody vote? It's Simon Hoare, isn't it? I mean, actually, I quite like Simon Hoare. I'm a Tory MP, but you know, he doesn't really feel very much pressure to do a good job, does he? In fact, citizens' assemblies are also mentioned, and referenda I just put there with a question mark. End on a controversial note. Thank you very much. Oh,